Hi, and welcome to Debunk File. My name is Sep, and today we're going to be talking about the Reddit user Crazysonthrowoff. The world of Reddit is one filled with mystery and intrigue, and a large reason for that is because there is a subreddit for basically anything you can possibly imagine. That's great if you were interested in a ton of stuff like us, but it's also a double-edged sword, as the weirdos that scour the internet also get to look and post about practically anything they want. One of the subreddits that has always attracted a lot of attention is the Confessions subreddit. Now, the title is self-explanatory. If you have a confession that you want to get off your chest, just post it here. This place has simple confessions like, I've never solved the Rubik's Cube before, and there are also deeper confessions about serious issues in an individual's life. However, there is that third boat that floats around, and I like to call it the really strange confessions boat, and today I will be sharing one of the posts that I have found. The title of the post reads, I stood by and allowed my wife to almost kill our son. I was happy she did it. And wow, yeah, that's pretty weird to say the least. Now, this is a very long post, and since it needs to be read in its entirety to be solved, what I decided to do was bring in a couple of awesome channels and just read this post in its entirety for you. And after that's done, we will talk about it. So sit back, get nice and comfy in your chair or bed, or wherever you are, grab some popcorn, and let's do this.
Okay, fair warning, this one is long as hell, apologies for that, but this is very hard for me, and I've been carrying it around for a lot of years. On the advice of my therapist, I've written it all out to try and work out my feelings on it. He didn't advise me to submit it to Reddit, of course, but I have struggled with this for a long time, and I need to hear other people's opinions on it. I still really have no idea how I feel about it, even after all these years, but I will submit for judgment by the masses. I know I did wrong on some things, probably a lot of things. I tried to do my best that I could. My son was very troubled. Very troubled. If you've seen the movie We Need to Talk About Kevin, it will really help to understand what I'm talking about. Because I swear to God, when I watched that film, I thought I was watching a documentary on my life. I felt the writer must have had cameras hidden in my damn house. That's how accurate it was. The only difference in that movie, the boy appears normal to his father and only reveals his true nature to his mother. With my son, he didn't have that mask. His insane behavior was the same with everyone. From the day he was born, my son just came out wrong. He was planned. My wife and I tried to get pregnant and were ecstatic when he was born. He was wanted and loved. We showered affection on him and really tried to give him a happy childhood. But from the day we brought him home from the hospital, he was miserable. He cried for 13 months straight. I'm not exaggerating, 13 months without a break. He cried until he had no voice left and kept crying. You could see his little face scrunched up and no sound coming out. There were times where he would literally be crying in his sleep. I've never seen or heard any other kid able to do that. We brought him to the doctors, specialists, tried changing his diet, held him, rocked him, toys, swaddling, music, mobiles, everything you could think of. Nothing worked. 13 months of grating, grinding, no sleep hell. Once he got over the crying stage, we thought we were out of the woods, but it quickly became clear that for some unknown reason, he was just angry at being alive. I never saw that kid have a genuine joyous smile once in the time I knew him. I saw him grin, a vicious, horrible grin many times, taking a perverse pleasure from causing pain or suffering on breaking a rule. But a smile from real pleasure at something nice? No, never. Not once. He had no interest in anything positive. He was fueled by hate, and everything he did was bent towards that. As soon as he could talk, his mission in life was to destroy things. He would break or try to break anything that came in his range. Smash it, chew it, throw it in the toilet, whatever he could. After a while, he figured out how to get his diaper off and took great pleasure in pooping and pissing anywhere he could. After a while, he figured out how to hide it and started pissing and pooping in places he wouldn't find right away, grinding it into the carpets, making it even more of a problem to clean and make the house stink. When he got older, ages 9 to 15, he would piss and crap in our bed until we got a lock on the door and he wasn't able to get in anymore. Then he'd just take a dump in the hallway in front of our room. That biological warfare started at around 2.5 years old, and he never grew out of it. I'll try to speed it up, as I could literally go on for days about this stuff, but as he grew older, he became more and more unmanageable. He would bite, kick, scream, scratch, and spit at anyone trying to do anything with him. He was kicked out of school twice before he was 9, then let him back in and then kicked him out for good. He had to change schools. The next one put him in a special class that kept him away from the other students. We had to install a door and a lock on the kitchen because he would steal knives and use them to gouge the walls, furniture, and chase people around with them. He was 10, he stabbed me pretty good in the hip and ass. I still have scars. As he grew older, he grew darker. He moved into setting things on fire and torturing local animals. There was a stray dog that hung out around the park near our house. My son blinded it in one eye with a barbecue fork. He would dip cats' tails in gasoline and light them on fire. He became a violent, stinking, vicious beast that lived in our house. We couldn't do anything with him. I will take this opportunity to preempt the tsunami of messages. Yes, we had the kid in therapy. He saw a psychiatrist twice a week and had God knows how many different medications prescribed to him over the years. Nothing worked. Therapy didn't work, meds didn't work, nothing worked. He was like a poison cloud of hate and fury lashing out at anything in his reach. When my son was 16, my wife got pregnant again. I can't tell you how different our reaction was. Instead of joy, we felt horror. This pregnancy had not been planned, and we really were at a loss over what to do. My son had been such an unending nightmare for 16 years. We couldn't take the idea of starting again from the beginning. We talked a lot about terminating. But A, access to abortion was not easy in those days as it is now, and B, my wife was very against it. We talked about my options. In the end, we decided that my wife would have the baby. And if it turned out evil, we would put it up for adoption. We knew we just couldn't do it again with another child like our son. We had a daughter. She was normal. Suddenly we saw what our lives should have been like the whole time. How things would have been had our son not been himself. She laughed at things. She breastfed without biting. She didn't have any teeth anyway, but you could tell she was just trying to eat, not tear her mum's breast off. After 4 months, she was sleeping through the night. She was happy. She was normal. I can't describe the relief of happiness we both felt. I don't have the words for it. This is where I believe I may have started really pulling back from my son. Up until that time, whatever mistake I made, I had always tried to do my best for my son. I am convinced of that. I tried to help him and love him and care for him. I really tried. But when my daughter was born, my wife and I both instinctively just turned towards her. She became our focus. Not from malice, but just because she was so much easier. She was so happy and sweet. Every moment we were with her was like magic. I understand this was wrong, but we honestly couldn't help it. I don't have a better explanation for that. My son hadn't cared about my wife being pregnant. I honestly don't know if he really understood it. But when we brought our daughter home, he started acting out even more. I didn't think it was possible, but he took it up another notch. At this time he was 17, and we were having blowout screaming matches daily. Usually, after we fought, he would storm out of the house and disappear for hours at a time, or come back the next morning. It was a relief. I started to actually look forward to our fights, because it would get him away from us for a while. After the birth of our daughter, my relationship with my son was almost entirely gone. Our only real interactions were screaming at each other. My wife was even worse with him. She just had nothing left. By that time, if our son ever came into the same room as her, she would just stop whatever she was doing and start screaming, "Get away from me, get away, get out," until he left. He started spending more and more time out of the house. which was a blessing for us. I have no idea what he got up to out in the world, but we were just happy it wasn't being inflicted on us. As a consequence of our son's behaviour, we had invested heavily in locks around the house. All of the cheap, thin interior doors in our home had been replaced with thick, dense wood doors that couldn't be kicked through, equipped with keyed locks that my wife and I carried. I know it sounds extreme, but locks and heavy doors were the best way to create safe spaces from him. And again, before I'm inundated with messages, I was not locking my son in rooms like a prisoner. He had free reign of the house and could go as he pleased. My wife and I would lock ourselves in rooms to protect ourselves from him. If anything, we were the prisoners of our own home.
On this day in question, I had fought with my son in the morning and he had left the house in a rage. My wife and I were enjoying some peace and quiet in the kitchen while our daughter napped in our bedroom. And then my daughter began crying. Any parent who has a young child can tell you, you get used to the sound of your child's cries, and you can tell after a while what they need. They cry differently if they are hungry or need changing, or they're just restless and want to be held. Babies can communicate pretty well before they can speak. This cry was none of those things. This cry was terror, pure terror. The second we heard it, my wife and I were both up and out of our chairs and running to the room. The door was locked, of course, and it took a few seconds to get the key right in. When we opened it, we couldn't believe it. My son was in the room. We lived in a bungalow, and the bastard had climbed in the window to get to her. He was standing over her crib with a steak knife in his hand. I have no idea where he got it. It wasn't one of ours. We controlled our knives very carefully and always kept them in locked drawers. I think he may have stolen it from one of our neighbors' houses. He had broken her skin twice already, once in the belly area and once on her arm. I could see blood running down. When I entered the room, he was dragging the back of the knife down her face, not cutting, almost tickling, teasing her while she screamed. He looked up at us and smiled. Before I even knew what I was doing, I was already moving, running to put myself between them. I didn't think about it, I just moved instinctively. Even with that, my wife got there faster. It was like a movie on fast forward. She got to our son and bashed his hand away and threw her whole body weight against him, knocking him away from the crib and bouncing him off the wall. I picked up my daughter and held her while my wife screened us. I could see her shaking, almost convulsing. I can remember the smell of the room, the sound of my daughter screaming and wailing, the look on my son's face as he stood there. Just nothing. Blank. Dead. There was nothing in his eyes. No emotion. He looked like an alien to me. I watched my wife take a step forward toward him. I could have reached out and stopped her, but I didn't. She stepped forward again, very close to him, and I could have stopped her again, but I didn't. She waited looking at him for maybe 3 to 5 seconds without moving, and then she punched him in the face. Now until this point, you may have been picturing my wife as a typical woman, small frame, dainty, delicate. This is not the case. My wife does have a small frame, but dainty and delicate, she is not. Never has been since I've known her. Since her early teens, my wife has been a boxer. MMA didn't exist back then, but karate and boxing were big in those days, and my wife was a very talented amateur. She was about 130 pounds, she carried a lot of muscle, and she knew how to punch. I had 70 pounds on her back then, and I have no doubt that in a real fight between me and her, she could have and would have pounded me flat. Neither of us had ever laid a hand on our son in anger before, but something broke in her that day, and all the years of anger, pain, sorrow, and frustration just came pouring out. When she hit him, his head snapped back and blood started pouring out of his nose. He hardly reacted. He just looked at her with this shocked expression like he didn't know how to process what had just happened. She waited another second, and then she hit him again. I could have reached out and stopped her. I could have dragged her out of the room, taken her away, calmed her down, but I didn't. I just stood there and watched while she systematically started to pound him to a pulp. Every time he brought his hands to cover one part, she would blast him somewhere else. Body, head, over and over. He started screaming, crying out, yelling for her to stop. It's the most genuine reaction I'd ever seen him have to anything in his whole life. But she wasn't stopping. I watched her ramping up, hitting harder, faster, working him like a heavy bag. He tried to swing at her, and she slipped him easily. She was on autopilot, sinking down into her training. I stood there watching for a minute. Then I turned my back on them and took my daughter out of the room. I brought my daughter to the kitchen and gave her a bath in the sink. I found that he had cut her a third time on the sole of her foot. All the cuts were superficial, but I cleaned her up and held her until she calmed. I put polysporin and band-aids on her cuts. In our bedroom, I could hear my son screaming, calling my wife horrible names, telling her he would cut her head off and rape her. After a while, I didn't hear him saying anything anymore. Didn't even hear him crying out. I assumed that he must have been knocked out, but I could still hear her beating him. That went on for a long time. Long enough for my daughter to drift off to sleep in my arms. I just sat at the kitchen table waiting for her to finish. Finally, she came out and sat down across from me. Her hands were swollen and red. Her face and arms were splattered with blood. Her chest was heaving. We just stared at each other without saying anything. After a while, I asked her, "Is he dead?" She looked back at me and answered, "I hope so." I nodded. That was all there was to say about that. I understood how she felt perfectly. I felt the same. I didn't know what to do, so we just sat there waiting silently. Eventually, my wife started crying and went to go take a shower. I just stayed there holding our daughter. After a long while, I heard moaning and sobbing coming from our room. It turned out that my son wasn't dead. I went in to see how bad it was, and it was pretty bad. I've never seen a more merciless beating laid onto anyone, before or since. He was lying on the floor, rolling around with blood leaking out of his face, lying in a pool of vomit. His nose was squashed flat out across his face. Both of his eyes were completely swollen shut and started to blacken already. I could see that a couple of his fingers were bent out at weird angles and he had pissed his pants. I think he must have been missing teeth, but I couldn't see any on the floor, and I couldn't see inside of his mouth. His lips were all puffed up and swollen. From talking to my wife about it later, I know now that she had systematically beaten every part of his body, focusing heavily on his legs. She told me she kicked him in the groin repeatedly until her legs got tired and had kept beating his body long after he had passed out. When my wife came out of the shower, I still didn't know what to do about our son. I didn't know whether to call the police or an ambulance, take him to the hospital myself. I honestly had no idea what I was supposed to do. After a while, I realized that I simply didn't care what happened to him anymore, and we decided to just let him live or die on his own. There was an in-law suite in the basement that we had never really used, and my wife, my daughter, and I just moved down there. We simply ceded the top floor of the house to my son and locked everything down, separating our lives entirely. There was plenty of food in the upstairs cabinets, enough for a couple weeks or more. He had a washroom and bedrooms to use. We had a washroom in the basement, a small kitchenette, and a separate entrance, so we just stopped going upstairs. We just decided we were done with him. I figured we'd let his food run out and see what happened. Over the next week, we could hear him moving around upstairs sometimes. I think he just spent most of his time lying in bed recovering. I went to work, watching on high alert in case he attacked me in the driveway, but he never did. My wife stayed home with our daughter. She was never out of our sight. One night, we heard him going ballistic, smashing things and banging. We didn't respond. He never tried to get downstairs or get near us, though. I think he was afraid that if he got near us, my wife might finish the job on him. After 3 weeks down in the basement, we hadn't heard anything from above for a few days, and I ventured upstairs to the main floor of the house. The place was demolished, and there was no sign of my son. He was gone. It took months to repair the damage he had done and get the main floor back to normal again. There was food and feces smeared all over the walls and broken glass on the floor, big holes in the drywall. He had ripped the place apart. He tore up the linoleum in the corner of the kitchen and emptied an entire foam fire extinguisher into the living room. I feel thankful that he didn't burn the house down with us in it. I'm honestly not sure why he didn't. The kid wasn't shy about lighting things on fire. After that, I lived in fear every day that he would come back, that he would ambush us out of the blue and try to kill us. We moved house about 3 years later, and I finally stopped being afraid that he would show up again, as now he had no idea where we were. I finally felt safe from him. All this happened a long time ago. My son was born in the spring of 1971. My daughter was born in 88, and I'm an old man now. I'll be 70 this year, and my wife passed from cancer in 2016. My daughter is 31 now. I moved in with her and her husband after my wife passed. I've got 2 granddaughters, and they are the joy of my life. I see a therapist a couple times a month to talk about all this. I don't know where my son is. The last time I saw him was when he was lying on the floor of our bedroom, bleeding and smashed. I haven't heard from him since he left, more than 30 years now. I don't want to. I carry a lot of guilt from that time and a lot of conflicted emotions. I didn't beat him myself, but I allowed him to be beaten, and I thought he deserved it. I was happy it happened. I didn't try to kill him, but I would have been happy if he had died. I will say that I hope he was able to overcome his demons and go live a normal life somewhere. If he wasn't able to do that, if he stayed the way he was, then I truly do hope someone out there killed him. When I knew him, he was a rabid dog, and whichever way it went, I just hope he still isn't out there hurting anyone else.
Wow, that was the single most insane thing I have ever read. But of course, there is a bright glaring question in the forefront of all your minds right now, including mine, and this is, was this real? Well, let's find out. What I'm gonna do is put the arguments in favor for each side. What I mean by that is I will explain how it could possibly be genuine, and then show why it could possibly be fabricated, and finally come up with the conclusion. I'm going to start with the reasons why the story could be real, and that is simply a condition called ODD, which stands for Oppositional Defiant Disorder, the definition for it being a disorder in a child marked by defiant and disobedient behavior to authority figures. One of the comments under the post said that if you Google accounts of children with ODD, every read is a trip. And yeah, I read some accounts of children with this disorder, and they are actually crazy. While this could possibly be the case, while researching I did notice that I didn't find a case that lasted nearly as long as it lasted here, and there were other Redditors that commented about other people with ODD turning themselves around. So if this is real, this might not be the case of ODD, and could be a case of something more extreme, such as full-on sociopathy or psychopathy. Now, onto the reasons as to why this story may be in fact a hoax. And I'm gonna start with some small things, like the age of the man. He is 69 years old, which is definitely a rare age to be using social media and writing a post like this. Again, this is kind of a nitpick, and it could be true, but you just don't normally see this. I think that the beating portion of the story and onward sounds ever so slightly fabricated too. It was shown with great detail that this person was beat to a pulp, and the police never got wind of this. Also, after he was absolutely obliterated and they moved to the basement, and they only stayed there for 3 weeks before he vanishes without a trace. Forever. I don't know about you, but after hearing just how bad he got beat up, I wouldn't think that he even been close enough in a condition to leave in just 3 weeks. Another reason this may be possibly fabricated is that it's just so well written, maybe even a little too well written. I don't know if this sounds like another absurd piece of criticism, but it's structured extremely well and feels like something that was planned out for a long time. The username simply being Crazysonthrowoff doesn't exactly help either. I don't see an old man making a Reddit username like that. It sounds almost like an alt account. Some might say that this even reads like a story on r/nosleep, which is a popular subreddit dedicated to telling creepy stories, so why not post it there? Well, on No Sleep, it is known that practically everything posted is fake. The Redditors here clearly didn't want this story to feel fake, so why would they post it there? Also, the Confession subreddit doesn't have many stories of this length, and the No Sleep subreddit does. So if we posted that story on No Sleep instead, it probably wouldn't have garnered nearly as much traction as it received in the Confession subreddit. And again, like mentioned earlier, it wouldn't be regarded as true on there either like he wants. This is most likely just a very talented writer who has had a passion to write this out for a while. It was posted on Reddit with the intention of raising an eyebrow and turning heads, and I'm willing to bet that the reactions he has gotten so far are the exact reactions he was envisioning. So after going through everything, it seems that we have debunked this mystery. I don't see anything in the future contradicting these claims that were just made right here. The only way this entirely shifts is if he comes out with a ton of proof regarding the situation, but that's highly unlikely. If he does though, believe me, we will be here to update you for sure. I hope you enjoyed this video. Quickly, I want to give a ginormous thank you to Nefarious TV and Inside of Mine for joining me on this video. You guys should definitely check out their channels as they are easily some of the finest creators in our field. Once again, thank you two so much. As always though, remember that word of mouth is the best way for us to grow, so tell all your friends about us. As always, my name is Sep from Debunk File. Bye guys.